Okay, picking up with voices and instrument families. So if you haven't done so already, please open up the lecture slides for this video lecture called Voices and Instrument Families and Style slides in Canvas in the Files section. All right, and then let's get started. So instruments. I think we've all become familiar with this term by now, but let's think about it with a nice formal definition. Perhaps maybe this is a way you haven't thought about it before, but okay, we're on slide number 2. So instruments are mechanisms that generate vibrations and launch them into the air. So if we look at this a little bit more closely, if I take my guitar here and I pluck, how about a chord? What's really happening here is that I am, when I pluck these strings, I'm making them vibrate, right? And if you, I don't know if you can, hopefully you can see this, but if I pluck this string, or even this string for that matter, you can maybe see it vibrating, right? And so what's happening here is these vibrations, I am, in a sense, launching them into the air when I pluck these strings, right? So, and different instruments sort of launch these vibrations into the air in different ways, right? A trumpet is doing it in a different way than the guitar. For this keyboard, for example, what am I doing here? How is this doing that? Now this is an electronic keyboard, so I have it hooked up to an amp, which you can't see, but it's right here. When I play some notes on the piano, right, the vibrations are really coming through the amp, right, and they're coming, and they are being launched into the air through the amp in this case. Okay, so let's now move on to our next slide. So let's revisit this term timbre. Now, I think we've talked about this 2 or 3 times so far, and we've described it as tone color, and so that is true, but maybe perhaps a little easier to understand this. Think about timbre as it's what makes a trumpet, right, sound altogether different from a guitar or a flute or any other instrument, or a piano, or a clarinet or a cello, right? So timbre is, we're talking about a specific quality of tone, right? So timbre is influenced by a number of factors, right? There are usually several factors that make one instrument sound different from another, right? So let's so first of all, the size of the instrument will help determine what it sounds like when we play it. So think about how about 2 similar instruments? How about a violin and a cello, right? So a violin is a smaller instrument than a cello. And so a violin tends to produce higher sounding pitches than the cello does. And the cello tends to produce lower sounding pitches than, a violin. So the size has something to do with the timbre, right? And right, the violin has a certain sound, and it's different from the cello, and it's kind of similar, right? They're both instruments which are they produce sound using a bow, generally, but they sound different, right? So the size has something to do with this. Think about the material from which the instrument is made. That also influences the timbre, right? An instrument made out of wood, right, has a certain quality of sound, and it's different than an instrument made out of metal, right? Like a trumpet. This is going to be that those materials help produce different timbre, different qualities of sound, right? And different instruments might be made out of wood, metal, but also maybe clay or plastic or even other materials. So size and shape of instrument and also material contribute to instruments that have different timbre. So another factor that goes into timbre is the manner in which the vibration is produced. So some instruments are plucked, right? Like a guitar. Like with a guitar, tend to pluck the string, right? When I do this, I'm plucking. When I play a scale, I'm plucking these strings and I'm producing different pitches, and I call it a scale. So, and that's what that sounds like. However, if I were to play a scale on a violin, right, I'd probably be bowing. I'd be using a bow. And that's going to have a different timbre, right, than plucking. Some instruments, you blow air through them, and that produces a different timbre, like a flute, for example. Some instruments are struck, right? Like we'll look at an instrument called a santur, and that is an instrument that has strings that are struck with like these hammer-like instruments. And that produces a different timbre. So timbre has many different factors that go into it. And again, it's just that the quality of sound, right? It's what makes one instrument sound different from another one. All right. So enough about timbre. Let's move on. Talk about register now. This kind of has to do with range. Remember, I think back in chapter 1, we spoke about range. And so register has to do with a specific area in the range of an instrument or voice. So look, let's talk about the keyboard here. What's the range? So I have, this is my lowest pitch and this is my highest pitch. That's the range of this instrument. Now, register has to do with specific areas within the range, such as we could say, how about high? So here's playing something kind of in the higher range of the, right? So that's in the relatively higher register. If I play kind of in the middle, this would be more like the middle range. Okay, and then of course, you know what I'm going to do, play in the lower register of this instrument, right here. I'll play. Okay, so that is the idea of range and register. Although, you know, this idea of range and register applies to all instruments. For example, with the guitar, let's see, what's my lowest note is this string that I pluck here, and my highest note is going to be here. And so that's my range, right? Lowest and highest. Let's see here on the piano, we could say, here's this pitch. And then my highest is going to be this D here. So we could say that my guitar has a smaller range, right, from here to here than the keyboard. Because the keyboard can go higher if we go this way, and it can go lower if we go this way. Now, the same idea of register applies here. So like if I play in the lower register, I'll be playing kind of in this area. And if I play kind of more in the middle register, I might be in this area. And if I play in a little bit higher, all right, I'm in this area, and then I could even go higher in a higher register, right, in that area. So that's the idea of range and register. Now, we also have these terms for the voice. So in the voice, we have kind of specific terms for different vocal ranges. So let's talk about these. So with the voice, we have we kind of split them up between male and female. So first off, in the female vocal range, the higher of the two we call soprano, and so lower than soprano is going to be alto, right? And so the soprano range tends to be from this area. Let's see here. Yep, so from about here to here. Whereas the alto range tends to be from about from here to here, so a little lower, right? So soprano, kind of this range, and then alto from here to here. And there's some crossover, right? So some sopranos, they can sing lower and kind of dip into the alto range, and some altos, right, can sing higher and kind of dip into the soprano range. Okay, and then for males, we have this idea of tenor and bass. So some guys we call them tenors, and some guys we call them basses. Tenors tend to have higher voices and higher vocal ranges than basses do. So for example, tenors tend to be kind of in between here and actually here and here. So from here to here, whereas basses tend to be a little lower, kind of in this area. So basses are lower than tenors, right? So tenors, again, are going to be about in this area, whereas basses are going to be kind of in this area. And again, there's some crossover here. And usually, people don't fit neatly, perfectly into these categories. Some people have larger ranges than others. Some guys can sing bass, but they can also sing all the way up into kind of the soprano range. And some women can do the same. They can sing soprano, but they can also sing really low into like tenor and bass range. So these terms, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, keep those in mind. And then we will move on to our next slide.